There's a moment that comes in a man's life that no one ever prepares him for. It's a quiet, confusing moment when the fire just dims. The same woman who once felt like an unsolvable magnetic puzzle, the one who occupied every corner of his mind, now barely stirs a flicker in his soul. Her touch, which used to be electric, now feels predictable, routine. He finds himself pulling back, not because he's angry, not because there's someone else. It's because something much deeper, and honestly, a lot more terrifying, has happened. He has started to see through the illusion. And when this happens, you think something is fundamentally wrong with you. But what if it's not? What if you aren't malfunctioning? What if you're just waking up? Long before any modern psychologist or self-help guru tried to tackle this, a philosopher of brutal honesty named Arthur Schopenhauer saw it with perfect clarity. He warned us that what we call love and passion isn't some magical gift from the universe designed for our happiness. He saw it as a trap, a biological compulsion designed for one thing and one thing only: reproduction. In his masterpiece, The World as Will and Representation, he lays it out cold. He says, the ultimate aim of all love affairs is actually more important than all other ends in human life, and is concerned with the composition of the next generation. Think about that for a second. What he's saying is that the force you mistook for destiny was just biology. The feeling you called falling in love was your own DNA manipulating your consciousness to serve a higher purpose, the continuation of the species. And once nature gets what it wants from you, or just as importantly, once it realizes it can't get what it wants through this particular person, the spell breaks, the veil falls. The hunger just fades. The fire doesn't just dim, it goes out. And you're left there in the quiet, thinking you're broken. But you're not broken. You're not a machine that's malfunctioning. You're a man who is beginning to awaken. A recent podcast I heard confirmed this exact pattern, shining a light on something men have felt for centuries but have never been given the language to explain. It pointed out that the idea of men as these insatiable, always-on creatures is a complete myth. The stereotype that the masculine impulse is a limitless, raging fire is just that, a stereotype. The truth is, that drive is incredibly selective. It burns white-hot in the presence of novelty, of mystery, of what we call polarity, that push and pull tension between the masculine and the feminine. But when it's faced with the mundane, with the endless routine of domestic life, it quietly suffocates. Modern relationships, especially the way we practice cohabitation, unknowingly smother the very flame they need to survive. We've been sold this idea that living together, sharing every single thing, merging two lives into one seamless existence, is the peak of romance. Schopenhauer would have laughed at that. He'd probably say you're taking a sacred primal instinct and putting it under the harsh, sterile, fluorescent lights of a laboratory. You're trying to dissect a dream, pulling it apart piece by piece, and then you're shocked when it no longer sings to you. He knew it then, and we see the proof of it today. Desire cannot survive total overexposure. This isn't just some pessimistic philosophical opinion. It's an observable fact, backed by science. The podcast I mentioned drew a fascinating parallel to something called the Westermarck effect. This is a well-documented psychological phenomenon where people who are raised together in close, sibling-like conditions during their early years develop a subconscious sexual aversion to one another. Brothers and sisters don't typically desire each other, not because of some great moral struggle where they have to resist temptation, but because for them the temptation simply isn't there. Deep, prolonged familiarity doesn't breed desire, it breeds repulsion. Now take that principle and apply it to a modern long-term relationship. When a man sees the same woman every single day, when he hears every complaint, shares every menial task, and witnesses every moment of vulnerability, the mystery that once fueled his attraction evaporates. The rituals become mechanical, the conversations become predictable, and his deeper biological nature starts to send a very clear signal. It says, this is no longer the mission. The objective has changed. Schopenhauer put it this way: what is being decided by your desire is not the weal or woe of the present individual, but the existence and special nature of the human race in future times. Do you see the truth in that? Your drive was never really about your pleasure, your emotional connection, or even the health of your relationship. It was a tool being used by the species. And once the species is no longer being served by that tool in that specific context, the impulse withdraws. It's not done out of spite. It's not a failure of your love. It's part of the original design. And now you're left in the silence, drowning in self-doubt and shame. But here is where Schopenhauer offers something that no modern therapist, no self-help book, and no pop psychologist can give you. He offers you philosophical dignity. He gives you an escape from the shame. He looks you in the eye and tells you, plainly, that the fading of your desire is not a malfunction. It's a message. It's a signal that the system has completed its primary task. And now, you are free, if you have the courage to accept it. That's the part nobody tells men. That this newfound freedom often feels a lot like emptiness. That the peace that comes after the storm of passion can feel like apathy. From the outside, your liberation from the constant pull of the drive might look like withdrawal or indifference. But from the inside, if you understand it correctly, it is the beginning of a higher state of awareness. Schopenhauer called the sexual impulse the most vehement of all cravings, a desire that seizes the mind and overpowers the will like a madness. So the real question is, what happens when that madness finally lifts? You don't collapse. You don't fail. You simply begin to see. When the fog of that madness lifts, a strange and unsettling clarity takes its place. It's the kind of clarity a man feels after waking up from a powerful dream or escaping a dangerous enchantment. He no longer sees her through that golden, hazy filter of longing. He sees her as she is, a human being, familiar, finite. And while he might still care for her, maybe even love and respect her deeply, the fire that once consumed his every thought is now just a pile of smoldering embers. This isn't indifference. This is sobriety. Schopenhauer understood this feeling perfectly. He saw that the lover imagines he is pursuing his own interest, while in truth he is serving an interest foreign to himself, the interest of the species. This is the ultimate betrayal most men never even realize happened. All those deep cravings, the poetic things you said late at night, the sleepless nights you spent obsessed with her, they were never entirely yours to begin with. You were a pawn in a biological chess game that's as old as time itself. You were a willing participant in a ritual whose goal was never your personal fulfillment, but simply the continuity of the human race. And when that goal is taken off the table, the ritual itself becomes stale and meaningless. Modern relationships, by their very structure, unknowingly put this entire process on fast forward. The closer two people get in their day-to-day lives, the more predictability crushes polarity. Shared bathrooms, synced Google calendars, The endless, looping conversations about groceries and which show to binge-watch next. These aren't just the practical details of life. They are erosion agents for desire. They dissolve tension, they blur boundaries, and they systematically dismantle the very architecture of attraction. Let's go back to that podcast and the Westermark effect, because this isn't just some throwaway scientific factoid. It's a major clue. It's maybe the most important clue in this entire mystery. Remember, children who grow up together in a sibling-like environment almost never feel a sexual pull toward one another as adults. The aversion is subconscious, but it's incredibly powerful. And it doesn't come from a moral rulebook. It comes from biology's deep, ancient programming to avoid genetic stagnation. Now, look at the parallels to a modern long-term couple. You often replicate the exact same conditions. You cohabit like siblings. You experience every high and every low together. You witness each other in states of sickness, stress, and vulnerability that, while building a certain kind of bond, are killers for allure. Over time, the bond becomes one of deep familiarity, not one of erotic romance. She becomes your closest companion, your family, but in the process, becomes physically less compelling. Men feel this shift in their bones. It's a visceral, undeniable change. Yet, our society has absolutely no vocabulary for it. There's no script for this feeling. So what happens? The man gets blamed. He's called lazy, broken, or emotionally distant. He gets shamed for no longer craving the very thing that once thrilled him beyond measure. But Schopenhauer, he understood. He knew that the will to life, that relentless force of nature, doesn't give a damn about the individual. It drives him blindly toward the goal of propagation. And once that goal is satisfied, or the path to it is closed, it leaves him feeling empty. But, and this is the key, that emptiness is not a sign of your failure. It is the quiet echo of a completed mission. Men need to get this through their heads. Nature is not your friend. It is not interested in your long-term happiness or the success of your marriage. It cares only that you chase and chase with everything you've got, long enough to pass on your genes. The chase is the spell. The consummation of that chase, or the point where she becomes completely and totally familiar, is the collapse of the spell. Afterward, the mask drops, and the person who once looked divine, magical, and otherworldly now looks disturbingly normal. In this sense, men don't actually lose their desire. They lose their interest in the illusion. What fades away is not your manhood. It's your delusion. What dies is not your virility. It is the fantasy that you could have raw, primal passion and comfortable, predictable domesticity coexist under the same roof indefinitely. They can't. Not under fluorescent lights. Not when routine has replaced mystery. This is exactly why so many traditional societies were structured completely differently, something the podcast also touched on. In many ancient or tribal communities, men spent most of their time with other men, working, hunting, going to war, building things. Women, in turn, had their own powerful sphere. Raising children and managing the community, the intimacy between the sexes was preserved for one simple reason. It was rare. That scarcity created tension, and that tension is what creates passion. We've completely lost that. Today, we pursue closeness at all costs, believing that more access, more sharing, and more time together will create more desire. But the exact opposite is true. Unfiltered access breeds familiarity. Familiarity breeds indifference. And indifference breeds a deep, gnawing confusion, especially for the man who was told and who believed that he would want her forever. But here's the hard truth. You were never supposed to want her forever in that same feverish way. You were supposed to wake up. You see, Schopenhauer wasn't just describing desire. He was diagnosing the entire human condition. And in his diagnosis, the fading of physical craving is not a disease. It is the beginning of sanity. The truth is, what most men are taught to call love is what Schopenhauer would have called captivity, a biological snare cleverly disguised as a divine connection. And when that spell finally lifts, when your eyes clear and your heart rate settles, you are left staring at a reality you never saw coming. You are no longer captivated. But the world doesn't prepare men for this moment. There are no ceremonies for the quiet departure of craving. There is no language for the subtle grief that comes when longing no longer wakes you up in the middle of the night. So men suffer in silence. They question their own identity. They wonder if age has dulled them, if something is missing in their hormones or their very soul. But the only thing that's missing is the lie you were told. Schopenhauer wrote a line that is so brutal, so honest, it often gets laughed off or misunderstood. He said, "The postcoital feeling of disgust is the true voice of nature." Now that sounds harsh, but it's not a punchline. It's a revelation. He's talking about that fleeting moment of emptiness right after gratification. The one you never, ever talk about. The one that feels like a kind of spiritual letdown. That, Schopenhauer says, is the sound of nature retreating. The will to life has just completed its mission. The puppet strings that were pulling you forward suddenly go limp. And in that disorienting stillness, you get a glimpse of the truth. You were never fully in control. This isn't romantic. This is reality. And for the man who is finally waking up, reality is rarely comforting at first. Once the primal dance ends, once she becomes completely known, you're not being ungrateful or cold for feeling a shift. You're just responding honestly to a total loss of polarity. The tension is gone. And some men, in a panic, try to artificially recreate it. They chase novelty through affairs, through fantasy, through addiction. But none of it works, not for long, because they're still misunderstanding the fundamental problem. They think their fading interest is a defect that needs to be fixed, rather than a signal that needs to be understood. You see, the masculine drive isn't an infinite resource that just sprays out in all directions. It's targeted. It's like a laser beam. It ignites in the presence of possibility, of risk, of a prize that is just beyond your reach. Once that prize is secured, owned, and completely normalized, what's left to chase? The energy doesn't just vanish into thin air. It simply pulls back, looking for another outlet, another problem to solve, another world to conquer. And this is where Schopenhauer offers not just a diagnosis, but a path forward. He didn't believe in just numbing the pain or chasing hedonistic pleasures. He believed in transcendence. He believed in turning away from the false promises of worldly satisfaction and redirecting all that powerful energy toward something better, toward clarity, discipline, and insight, toward your true work. In his view, the man who outgrows his biological desires isn't cursed. He's chosen. He has a rare opportunity. Schopenhauer called this the negation of the will, a quiet, powerful rebellion against the endless, exhausting chase. The man who no longer thirsts for every new touch or every new thrill isn't dying. He's maturing. He is finally reclaiming the one thing nature borrowed from him for its own purposes: his mind, his agency, his soul. And yet, this path is incredibly lonely. It's lonely because almost no one speaks about it. The world still screams at you that masculinity is measured by your hunger, by your performance, by your conquests. But what if true masculinity is measured not by how much a man wants, but by what he has the strength to walk away from? What if losing interest isn't a collapse, but an evolution? There is a silent revolution happening in the hearts of men everywhere. It's a transformation so subtle, so unspoken, that even the men going through it don't always recognize what's happening. They just feel less compelled, less entangled by the same forces that once stirred them up like a storm. At first they panic. Then they grieve the loss of that intensity. And finally, if they are wise, they begin to understand. They aren't becoming less of a man. They are becoming more of themselves. Schopenhauer didn't write to make you feel comfortable. He wrote to set you free. And his core message is that true liberation comes not through endless indulgence, but through renunciation. Not by desperately trying to cling to the flame, but by outgrowing the need to be burned. As he said, every man takes the limits of his own field of vision for the limits of the world. But when that field of vision expands, when the veil of craving finally lifts, your entire world opens up. You realize that what you once called intimacy was often just dependency. What you once called love was often a form of addiction. And what you once called chemistry was just a glitch in your biological software, designed to keep you tethered to the demands of the species. And suddenly, in the quiet stillness of that lost desire, you find something you haven't had in years. Room. Room to think. Room to create. Room to observe. Room to finally step back from the game and see it not as a sacred destiny, but as a staged play. Not as a divine union, but as a clever trick of evolution dressed up in poetry and perfume. Schopenhauer said, "A man can do what he wills, but he cannot will what he wills." That's it, isn't it? That's the heart of it all. You cannot force yourself to want what has already been consumed by familiarity. You cannot reignite a fire that was never truly yours to begin with. It belonged to nature. Its work is done, and it has moved on. And what it leaves behind is not an empty void, but a profound clarity. Now, that clarity is often misdiagnosed as depression. A man who no longer feels the compulsion to pursue is labeled as numb or defective. But what if he isn't depressed? What if he's finally free from a lifelong addiction? What if the silence he feels is not the absence of meaning, but the very beginning of it? Men, hear this clearly. Your fading desire doesn't mean you have failed. It means you are winning. It means you've crossed a threshold where the mirage no longer works on you. And now you face a choice. You can spend the rest of your life trying to reignite a fire that only ever burned to deceive you. Or you can walk into the stillness and, for the first time, claim your mind as your own. This is the real initiation. Not your first kiss, not your first conquest, and not your wedding day. The real initiation is the moment you can look at the thing you once worshipped and realize without anger or sadness that it no longer moves you. Not because you've become cold, but because you have evolved. You've outgrown the game. If you've made it this far, and if these words are resonating in that quiet place inside you, then it's time to break the silence. Share this with other men who you know are suffering in confusion, blaming themselves for what is a perfectly natural evolution. Like this video. Share it with someone who needs to hear this. And subscribe if you want more of the hard truths that they're too afraid to tell you. You're not broken. You're becoming free.